Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Saddleback webinar this week. My name is Liz Mangus, Literacy Specialist with Saddleback Educational Publishing. Of course, we are thrilled that you are joining us. We like to begin a little bit early to let you get comfortable, locate the chat, locate the Q&A. Go ahead and start jumping in, letting us know where you are joining us from in the chat area. One thing to keep in mind about the chat, you'll probably hear me say this a couple of times. This is how we're going to interact during our session today. So please, before you hit send, make sure that you select from the dropdown all panelists and attendees so everybody can see what it is you have to say. Otherwise, it will just be me and Michelle seeing what you have to say, and that's okay too, but it's way more fun if everybody can participate. So go ahead and select all panelists and attendees in the chat when you communicate with us today. If you could reserve your questions for the Q&A area, that will allow us to get to them a little bit more efficiently. And we look forward to answering any questions you have today, either for Saddleback or for our presenter today. We will get started at 3 o'clock, which is our normal time, 3 o'clock Eastern time. And in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind, please go to Twitter. This is where you can find us. Let everybody know you're joining us for this opportunity today. And this will allow us to continue the conversation after our webinar today as well. So you can share any tips or takeaways with your network and kind of continue the learning, even though the webinar might be over. So while we're waiting to get started, let's bring in Michelle. How are you today, Michelle?
I'm good. I'm back.
Yes,
Yay.
we are, of course, you are a fan, like I like to say, a fan favorite.
Stop it
This is
louder. Quit it some more.
this is your third or
Third,
fourth?
yeah, third. What
Third
am I going to
webinar with
do
us.
when I don't have Saddleback webinar on my calendar? I'm going to be so sad.
Well, we'll have to put another one on your calendar. We can solve that problem. Hi, Anna. Thank you for joining
Hi, Anna.
us.
And look, we have someone from Ecuador. Did you see that, Liz? That's exciting.
All right.
And
Thank you
Rio
for
Grande
joining us.
City. Hi, Patricia from Rio Grande City,
All right. Thank
Georgia.
you. As we are as you're joining in today, as you're logging in, go ahead and let us know where you are located. We always love to see where everybody is joining us from. So of course, we always have a good showing from Texas. Vivian, so nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. And Anna, I haven't seen you in so long. I hope you're well. And maybe someday we'll be able to get back out there onto the road and see each other again at a conference sometime. All right, San Marcos, Texas. That's my
New
neck of the
Jersey,
woods.
Los Angeles, another Rio Grande City, Georgia. Yay,
All
how
right.
exciting. Costa Mesa, look at that.
That's right, Southern
California.
California.
Love it. I miss you, Liz. Oh,
Oh, I miss you too, Anna. See, this is this COVID thing. But
hi,
you know what?
Tim.
We're all pulling together. So doing what we can do. So we're going to talk about project-based learning today. And of course, Michelle is going to do the heavy lifting and share everything that she has learned about project-based learning through this process. We also have a special guest coming in to talk for a few minutes named Sarah Potter, who is a teacher who can speak to how this all works. So Michelle will tell you a little bit more about Sarah before she jumps in to kind of share her knowledge as well. So we have a great session planned for you today. And this is a session that sort of came out of your previous webinar with us, Michelle, where people were asking a lot of questions about assessment and authentic assessment, and project-based learning sort of came up in the midst of that. And we decided, you know what, hey, maybe we do a webinar on project-based learning and give the people what they want.
Let's
So
do it. Yeah.
so that's our goal today, is we're going to talk about that project-based learning. So if you could in the chat let us know, is this something you have tried? Is this something that you have not tried but you're curious about? Or is this something you do on a regular basis? What is your relationship with project-based learning?
Hi, Jill. Looking forward to hearing from you. Yay. Thank y'all for coming. This is exciting. This is my
Very
favorite part, is
exciting.
reading the intro chats.
I know, mine too.
Tried.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting, Michelle, because maybe this is something that people they have tried, but they don't know that they've tried it, right?
I
Maybe
have a slide for that. Look at
there are
that.
there may be elements of project-based learning that are part of your practice that you already use, but just don't call it by that particular name. So, okay. Hi, Carla from Portugal. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, Carla, my kid, my 5-year-old is obsessed with Portugal because it is in one of his train videos. And
Uh,
he put on his backpack recently and told me he was going to Portugal. And I'm like, okay. So there
oh,
you go, Carla.
that is so cute. Okay, so want more information on best practices, and I've heard a lot from but now fully implemented project-based learning. Okay, well, this
Experiment.
is going to be very informative, and I know that Michelle, you worked very hard on putting this together for us. So let's go ahead and officially get started.
Excellent.
Project-based learning is something that I feel like it's been popping up more and more. And I don't know if this is a result of just trying to cope with the different medium that we're now teaching in, many of us, or if it's just project-based learning's time in the spotlight. But either way, there seems to be more curiosity about this way of teaching and learning. And so we wanted to get some more information. And Michelle, thank you so much for being here and putting this together for us. Let me give everybody a very brief introduction in case you don't know Michelle. I suspect most of you do, but just in case. I'm not even going to read anything, Michelle.
Thank you.
I'm just going to
Yes,
tell them
thank you.
about you.
Just tell me.
Michelle is a consultant with Sidelets Education. She has been a teacher, an instructional specialist. She is perpetually curious and a learner, especially about all things newcomers and English learners. That's really where her heart is. And she just so enjoys studying and helping teachers improve their practice and getting the best outcomes for students. So she is welcome on Saddleback Webinar anytime. She's also author of, here it is, Pathways to Greatness. This is for newcomers. This is a book about newcomers. Great book, highly recommend it. So thank you so much, Michelle, and also Sarah, who you're going to introduce in a few minutes, who will be hopping on. I'm going to step back and let you take it from here.
Excellent. Let me share my screen. Liz, you're still sharing. Would you like to unshare? There we go. One second, I'm sharing my screen.
Okay.
I'm like, something weird happened.
All right.
Liz, tell me when you can see my screen. Okay.
I will let you know. Everybody says, no problem. Don't worry about it. These things happen.
We practiced this, y'all. I'm serious. We really did.
We did. We made sure everything was working, but this is the way
This is
technology
how it
goes
goes. Okay,
sometimes.
there we go.
Oh.
What is wonky? Wonky is our academic word for, okay. Can you see my screen, Miss Liz?
I can see, yes, yes.
Everything looks great, right?
Everything
Okay.
looks good. Yes.
Small panic attack there for just a second. So, okay, guys, thank you for coming again. I've loved doing these webinars. It started with one webinar on low tech, no tech issues a few months ago. And then from that webinar, someone said, hey, we want more information on assessment. So Liz and I are like, okay, I can totally do that. That's still in my wheelhouse. Then when I did my assessment webinar a few months ago or a few weeks ago, someone said, we want more information about project-based learning. And when I was speaking to Liz about it, I was like, project-based learning is not my area of expertise. It really isn't. This is definitely a topic that I've spent several weeks researching. So you're getting the perspective from someone who's kind of new to this. And I do have a slide towards the end that says what I've learned as I went through this research to learn more about this topic. And one of the things I realized is I guess I knew more about it than I thought. So some of you in the comments who mentioned that you've done this before and you're sort of on a higher level of expertise, you probably know more about this than I do. But I did enjoy researching this topic because, as Liz said, I do like to learn more about things that affect us in education. And being a teacher, a former teacher of newcomers and author of the Pathways book, I feel like the whole component of authentic learning and authentic assessment, that's where this topic of project-based learning does intersect with what I do, which is talk about developing academic language for students and for ELLs and specifically newcomers. So that's a long introduction. If you came to my session before on assessment, I did take a few of the first slides because I did want to, again, kind of mention how this topic of PBL, project-based learning, came to be. So here's what we're going to do for our next hour or so. We're going to explore the topic of project-based learning, and I have 3 questions that I want to answer for you today, and that is, what the heck is this? So some of you are coming and you're like, I don't know a lot about PBL. Tell me about it. Why is it so effective? As Liz mentioned, and I don't really have an answer either, I'm hearing and reading more about project-based learning. And as Liz said, I don't know if it's a result of all of our students learning virtually or online, or perhaps we're realizing that we need to make our learning and assessment more authentic, or maybe it's a little bit of both. But I do see an uptick in the number of people, or maybe it's just I never noticed it before and now I do. So who knows? But it's really effective. And being a researcher and someone who likes numbers, that part of researching for this topic I really appreciated, because I like to see numbers. I want to see statistical analysis of the effect that some of these things have on teaching and learning. So we're going to talk a little bit about why it's so effective according to research. And then most importantly, tell me what you do on Monday, right? Okay, that's great, Michelle, but how the heck do I do this? And then we're also going to share some examples. And as Liz mentioned, I do have my friend and colleague as our guest speaker today. She's going to tell us authentically about some project-based learning that she's done in her school with her beautiful children. So without further ado, what is, and Liz asked you this question already, but I wanted to make it more official. If you could, let's rate ourselves where you are coming to this session, where you are with your knowledge base. I want you to give yourself a 1 if you love project-based learning, you do it all the time, you talk about it at the dinner table, you read your kids' bedtime stories about project-based learning, like you're the guru. So you're a 1 if you're the guru. I want you to give yourself a 2 if, okay, so I previously did something with project-based learning. I don't really know if I did it right, but yeah, I've heard of it. I want you to give yourself a 3 if, okay, I've heard of it, but I've never actually tried it. And I want you to give yourself a 4 if you know very little about it, but you're really intrigued and you can't wait to hear more about it. And I want you to give yourself a 5 if your principal made you come to this. I'm just kidding. Don't give yourself a 5. That was a joke. Hopefully you're laughing. Okay. Ooh, lots of 3s. Look at that, Liz. Lots of 3s, some 2s. Oh, I'm going to be scared if you gave yourself a 1 because you probably know way more about this than I do. Okay, cool. Good. So lots of 2s, lots of 3s. Maria's laughing. Thank you, Maria. My jokes, I try to be funny. 3, 4. Perfect, perfect. No 5s. So nobody's principal made them come today. That's excellent. Perfect. Okay. So here's a little bit of background about how this webinar came to be and really just how this is grounded in my work that I do. So I did a webinar previously, and that link is on the Saddleback website under the webinar series if you want to go back and take a look at that. It was all about authentic assessments, and especially now in the age of COVID, how do I authentically assess kids? So I did just a little bit of background on grading, and there's only 3 or 4 slides here. Grading versus assessing. So grading is when we want to evaluate. So the key word there is evaluate. We want to evaluate a student's individual learning and performance. And when we grade, we take into consideration things like attendance, participation, effort, all of those things that we might consider when we're grading a kid. But when we're assessing a kid, we want to measure so that we can improve student learning. So I think there's a distinct difference between grading and assessing. And I know as a young teacher, I probably just kind of put all this into one category, but really assessing a kid means I'm going to use the information that I gather to adjust and improve my practices. and to make sure kids are attaining those standards that I set out to attain. So we really need to ask ourselves, what is our goal? Whatever we're doing in class, what is our goal? Do I need a grade, or am I really assessing them? Do I need a number, or do I need something to put in a grade book or on a progress report, or do I really want to know where my kids are so that I can move forward with that information? Just a little bit of a distinction there. So again, evaluating versus measuring and improving. So grading is best, not only, but best when we are looking at large amounts of student data. And then of course, assessing is best if we want to measure individual progress. Again, more information about these two particular components in that previous webinar I did, but I'm just building up to how project-based learning comes into play and ties into all of this. Liz, and I'm sorry, my computer's doing something wonky again. Can you still see my screen, Liz?
I can, yes.
Okay.
And if it comes to it, if we need to put your slides, if you need me to put your slides on my end and control them for you, we can do that too if this keeps up.
Okay, it's working again. I don't know
All
what's
right.
going on. So whether we're grading, assessing, whether we're talking about project-based learning or more traditional direct teach lecture, whatever we're calling it this week, we really have to think about beginning with the end in mind. So really we have to ask ourselves, what do I want students to learn? What the heck is it that I want students to learn? Well, in Texas, those of you who are listening in Texas, you know, we have our TEKS. Many of you have Common Core standards. Whatever your academic content standards are, what do we want kids to learn? And then how are we going to gather evidence that that learning is actually taking place? So we ask ourselves these two questions, regardless of what is happening into our classroom. And then once we've established, what am I learning? How am I going to measure that? Okay, so great. What lessons or activities, this is the middle, the sandwich, right? What lessons or activities are going to successfully lead to that learning? So what do we want them to learn? How are we going to prove that we've learned it? And then what's all the stuff in the middle? So these last two bullets, to me, as I was thinking about this, that's where project-based learning comes into play. How are we going to gather evidence of learning? Okay, so of course we already have our standards, but how are we going to gather evidence of that learning? And then what lessons, activities, what projects can my students complete, as opposed to maybe a more traditional paper and pencil test? What projects, what activities can my students complete that's going to demonstrate that learning effectively? So it's about shifting to this new assessment mindset, or this new learning mindset. Essentially, we're going to move kids beyond simple facts. And I want to be very clear on this. I'm not suggesting that we completely abandon everything that we do traditionally. I just think this idea that project-based learning deserves some consideration, at least in some of our lessons that we're presenting to our kids. So it really is, as we'll look at some slides here in a minute, it moves kids beyond that resuscitation of like basic facts. It's where they're going to apply their knowledge to some kind of scenario. And Sarah Potter, my colleague, is going to tell you a really great example about how she did that with two projects that she does with her kids. And what I read over and over and over again, whether it was anecdotal things on Twitter or actual research papers that I've looked at to prepare for this webinar, this idea that project-based learning increases motivation by encouraging collaboration among students. So I think that was a really important component as well. If you're not familiar with this, the link, by the way, any of the references that I make throughout the presentation are at the end of the PowerPoint with links that you can go to. This idea of 21st century skills, and I could do a whole, Liz, don't quote me on this, or you could, this whole idea of 21st century skills. So what are the skills that are necessary for our students to be successful in the world that we live in now? Things like critical thinking and communication, creativity, media and technology use. And there's a whole website, and you can find that link at the bottom of your, at the end of the PowerPoint. But I think these skills are important. So yes, our traditional skills of reading and writing and doing math, those are also very essential, but also this idea of critical thinking. Think about kind of jobs that our kids are going to have when they graduate from high school and college. Think about the kind of jobs that are available even now that require this sort of collaboration and these other skills that we don't necessarily direct teach or even assess in a more traditional classroom setting. So a lot of great information about 21st century skills if you want to take a look at that. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to introduce my colleague Sarah, and let me tell you how this went down. So at 11:30 this morning, I was thinking about Sarah, and I was thinking about some of the projects that she does in her school. So I picked up the phone and I called Sarah after she texted me for about something else. And I was like, hey, remember that project you told me about? Can you tell me a little bit about it? Because I really want to share it in my webinar today. So as Sarah was talking and explaining her project, I said, listen, what are you doing at 2 o'clock? Because there's no way I'm going to be able to explain this project and do it justice. So my friend, Sarah Potter, agreed literally 2 hours ago to chime in, and we put some slides in for her really quick because I want her to tell you about 2 projects she does with her kids. And I think what we'll do then is we'll use Sarah's example as we move forward through the webinar and talk about why project-based learning is effective. What are some things I need to consider, all reflecting on Sarah's example. So Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. And if you would like to come on, again, this is my former friend, my former colleague, still my friend, Freudian slip friend. And I'm going to let Sarah talk. Sarah, I'll promote your slides. Just let me.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Yes, Michelle called me today at 11:30 and somehow I'm here. And so I'm really excited to be here today. And I'm sorry if I'm up here a little bit nervous. Michelle was talking about project-based learning, and it really did fit into what we do currently on our campus. I'm in Texas and Pasadena ISD and at Southeastern High School. And so our ESOL teachers, our English for speakers of other language teachers, we do 2 major projects a year. So Michelle, thank you. Okay, so one thing that we notice is we have our ESOL classes are designed for students who are in the first 3 years of being in the country. And so we have kids from all over the world, as well as all different types of language proficiencies. So one thing that we knew that they would also be lacking is their knowledge in US history. So what we wanted to do was create a project that would be cross-curricular. And not only would it support what they're learning for their English class, for their ESOL class, but also to support the US history standards that they were going to be responsible for in their 11th grade school year when they have a state assessment, their STAR assessment. So again, this was cross-curricular, and it also supported our English language growth. In Texas, we take TELPAS every spring, and I know in other states there may be the ELPA 21, the Axis, or if you're great like Texas and your state does their own thing. Again, our kids are being assessed in all those different domains. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And again, we wanted to create a project that was going to hit all these things and help those students. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So we do 2 projects. We do one in the fall, that's a group project, and then we do one in the spring. So the one in the fall is called This American Life. It's events that impacted the history of the United States. And the spring is an individual project. However, we'll talk about it in just a second, but our students who are new arrivals second semester, we still allow them to work in a small group. And that one is Famous Americans, a Living Wax Museum. So both of these projects are taken from our US history standards. And these projects can vary from, famous Americans, it could be Oprah Winfrey all the way to Theodore Roosevelt. So it's anybody that could possibly be tested on their US history exam in the 11th grade, as well as just people that is important for our kids to know as they are newcomers to our country. You go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit more detail of what these requirements are, but basically the project, even though there's 2 different projects in the fall and the spring, they kind of follow the same requirements. They're going to be writing a paper. They're also going to have a timeline of events that might either be on that person with their accomplishments, or it just might be of that particular event in US history. They have to do a speech. There will be a visual display, and that will be a trifold board. It could be a Google Slides or a PowerPoint presentation. And then at the end, they also have to create a 10-question quiz over their topic that has higher order critical thinking questions. Okay, so this is just an example of the one that we do in the fall, which is about events. So again, this is a group project. So the very first thing that we do is we look at our standards, our Texas state standards, and we determine which events do our students need to have some kind of background knowledge on before they get to U.S. history. Now, I know every state does things differently, but in Texas, in 8th grade, our kids have U.S. history, and then they have almost like the second part of U.S. history in their 11th grade year. So any new arrivals that are coming in 9th, 10th, or they're missing what an 8th grader would have learned. So a lot of our events and our people that we talk about, a lot of them are about the first half of U.S. history that maybe they might have missed. So if you see on the screen, we also want to make sure that we're assigning groups based off of ability levels. So the teacher looks at the ability of her classroom, and this ability is based on their English language proficiency. It's also based on, their reading levels and their writing levels, and they kind of pair them up based on who can support one another. Also, another thing that we keep in mind for this particular project is some things are easier to research than others. For instance, you might find more information on, let's say, the Boston Tea Party than the Pony Express. So we want to make sure that our kids that have more English language proficiency and higher reading levels, that they're maybe given the more complicated topics. Another thing we also do, we do this for both our ESOL 1 and ESOL 2 classes, which is our 9th grade English class and our 10th grade English class. So we also want to make sure that the 9th graders have certain topics to choose from, and our 10th graders have other topics to choose from. That way, when the child becomes a 10th grader, they're not redoing the project that they did from the 9th grade. So we put a lot of thought as our group of teachers of who is assigned what project. Okay, next screen. One of the very first things that we do is immediately after they're assigned their person or their event, we do a KWL chart. You can tell we've been doing this for a while. So this is back from 2016, 2017. But we just want to make sure that the kids, what do they already know about the event? What do they want to learn? And, just the things that they're going to be continuing to learn as they're researching their project. Okay, next. Then we do a timeline, and the timeline is very explicit. We give them a rubric. We tell them how many details and how many events, or if it's about a person, how many accomplishments that we want them to include on the timeline. And this will help with not only, again, learning about those U.S. history standards and understanding timelines, but it's also about helping them prepare them to write their paper. Okay, next. So this is for the spring project, and it's all kind of based off of the Time Life magazine. So this is kind of like the rough draft of what their poster is going to look like. This is a picture of my former ESOL teacher, one of the ones who kind of spearheaded this project a few years ago. And so she was just showing examples of what the Time Life magazine looked like. And then the students, as you can see here, some examples of what that might look like. So again, there's checkpoints along the way. This has to be vetted by the teacher. It has to be, look for errors, make sure that there's correct information. And if you notice, like on this 9/11 one, it says terror in the United States. So the students had to come up with a creative title. It couldn't just be 9/11. So they had to come up with that with their group to be creative in that. Okay, next. So this is what a final product would look like. So here again is the magazine cover. And then in the end, this is what was approved and then put on their trifold poster. And then they had to have information. Most of the time, the things that we want included on there is the who, what, when, where, why, how. And again, for both projects in the fall and in the spring. Okay, next. So final draft, you can tell these are actual examples from our students of the papers that they had to write. And you can tell, even though we had newcomers, we did support them with whatever they may need, if they needed stems, frames. But there was a lot of vetting throughout the way, a lot of checkpoints before they got to this final draft piece. And then they had to write a quiz. So the quiz was then also given to other group members. So they all had to come up with their own quiz, even if it was a group project. So this is what some final presentations look like. I know that this is the year of COVID, so I'm going to kind of talk about that in just a second. So this was last year and the year before. We kind of set up this project to be, we invited school members, district staff, parents, community members. However, we did not invite students to these presentations because we did not want them to have their affective filter high. We wanted that to be lowered for them, and for them to be able to speak and practice their English when they were doing their speeches. It was set up science fair style, so you could rotate between the groups. It wasn't that they were in front of a whole room of people, but every time you came to them, they had to do their speech. So this one is for the fall, where they're talking about events, but in the spring, when it's a living wax museum, and I do have a couple pictures at the very end, they actually take on that person and they dress up as the figure that they're just, yes. So here's a mixture of both. So you can see we have Charlie Chaplin, Lewis and Clark. And so you can kind of see where students are, dressed as that person would be. For it being this year, so we still want to do this project. I know things are going to be a little bit different. Not all of our students are currently learning on campus, but doing the oral presentation through Flipgrid or on Schoology with an audio recording are some different ways that we're kind of thinking about doing that final project. Of course, the paper and the timeline, those are things that can be done still in a group with breakout rooms on Google Meets or in a Zoom meeting. But for the actual oral presentation, that's the part that we're kind of still talking about. But again, we're looking into options such as Flipgrid. So I hope that was, did I answer everything? Or Michelle, do you have any questions for me?
No, but these babies are precious. Like, I'm so in love with Amelia Earhart right here, and I can't wait to hear how they go this year. So I was just some of the things that you mentioned that are part of my presentation here in just a few minutes, because I sprung this on Sarah at the last minute. She does have to leave. She can't stay through the whole presentation, but I love the fact that each step of your project kind of was that milestone. I know somebody else in the chat said it as well. The vetting and the milestones, and I'm going to talk about how important that is. And like the magazine cover, for example, was the step leading up to the trifold. And I love the fact that this could be cross-curricular. So for example, the paper that they're writing could be something they're working on in language arts while they're working on another piece. And yeah, I love it. And I just want to say again, I love you and thank you so much for coming in the very last possible minute. And I do want to tell y'all that if you ever hear Sarah speak in person, that my mom does not, in fact, pay her to hang out with me, because she likes to tell people that.
She really does. She really does.
So thank you, my friend Sarah.
I really enjoyed being with y'all today. I'm giving Michelle permission to give my information at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. So thank you. Have a great rest of the year.
Have fun at the eye doctor, friend. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Okay, guys, so I'm really glad we got to hear an example, because now as we move forward, this actually worked out really perfect. I'm really glad Sarah decided to text me for something else completely random this morning. So now as we go through the next few pieces, like what is project-based learning, what makes it so effective, and how the heck do I do it, we can kind of reflect back on exactly what Sarah did. So I'm really glad it worked out, and I'm really glad that Liz in Saddleback allowed me to add Sarah to my presentation at the very last minute. So after hearing from Sarah, what is project-based learning? If you've never heard of it before, let's do a couple of slides about that. So the what is project-based learning? And I got to tell you, if you are an expert on project-based learning, one of the things I've noticed as I went through the research is that some folks are real sticklers for what exactly qualifies as project-based learning. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, but essentially with project-based learning, students they're doing a project, right? They're creating, they're performing, or they're applying their knowledge in order to demonstrate that they've learned the standards, that they have some proficiency and some understanding with the standards. Another definition was, they take a real world problem or real world applications, and they use that real world problem as the lens through which they're going to learn their standards to promote learning and promote engagement. And what I noticed about some sticklers for project-based learning is, some woman posted an example. It was some tweet or some blog or something that I was looking at a few days ago. She posted her example and she was calling it project-based learning, but then someone else was commenting that it wasn't really project-based learning because the kids weren't really solving a problem. So I was like, wow, I'm not sure it really matters that much whether you're solving a problem, because in Sarah's examples, wonderful engagement with her newcomers, and I'm not so sure that they were actually solving a problem. So I wouldn't split hairs on that too much. But the bottom line is this project-based learning is yielding a tangible product. And again, in Sarah's example, we had, what do we have? The magazine cover, the KWL chart, the essay, the PowerPoint, the trifold, the presentation. So multiple products that the students were creating, and that final performance of them presenting that information. And all of that serves as evidence of student learning. So I think, from my perspective as a consultant working with English language learners, what I appreciate about this is the fact that it frees you up from standing in front of the class and delivering information, and rather you serve now as the educator, you're the facilitator, and it gives you a little bit of time to maybe work with some of those needier students, and you help students with the inquiry, and you help students with that reflection piece. So I just love this idea that the teacher's freed up a little bit now to support and work with kids as needed. One of the other things I kept reading is, again, this idea that we're moving students away from rote memorization. Y'all, there's some people out there, as I researched this topic, that have some really strong opinions about, and I'm just presenting this, I don't know where my opinion lies just yet, but this really strong opinions about moving kids away from rote memorization, because the ability for kids to look information up now, and many people are making the argument that the skill of accessing information and being able to parse through information and be able to evaluate information at a critical thinking level is much more important skill than just randomly memorizing facts. So I thought that was an interesting take as well. So this idea that project-based learning is a more valuable skill, because rather than kids memorizing facts, they're actually applying that information to their projects or their experiences. So this idea that project-based learning is authentic, that it's open-ended, that it's more complex than just memorizing a bunch of facts. So I thought that was an interesting take as well. Something else, as I was, again, going through this, I was constantly putting many of you know I'm a former high school science person, so I was putting that hat on, and I was thinking, okay, how would I have embraced this as a teacher? And this idea that the pressure that I felt as a young teacher to cover my standards, right? I've got a scope and sequence to keep up with, and I have benchmark testing that I need to prepare my kids for, and wow, I can't take the time to teach one standard through one project. But one of the things that Sarah mentioned, and I want to reiterate here, is that her projects, Liz is doing it again. There we go. Her projects covered multiple standards across multiple curriculum points. So that's definitely an option. She mentioned her English for speakers of other languages, which is in the state of Texas, takes the place of their English 1 and English 2 class in high school. And then 2 other courses that kids were getting credit for, she addressed TEKS in those courses, as well as pulling those social studies standards. So you can take many standards and kind of roll them into one project. And what's really cool is, again, just like Sarah mentioned, and I wrote these slides before I even spoke to Sarah about her project, so it's perfect how it worked out. You notice that breaking this huge project, which I don't know if she mentioned it, but these projects are about a month long, but she breaks these month-long projects down into these smaller pieces, these smaller tasks, and those smaller tasks the purpose of those smaller tasks, the kids are assessed on those individual or those smaller tasks, and they also act as milestones to make sure that kids are moving forward on the overall project. So when your KWL is due, and when your magazine article or magazine cover is due, and your paper is due. So it's not like they just get a month and at the end of the month there's a project due. There's time management skills. And speaking of that, at the end of the presentation, when Liz tells you about what's coming up on the next Saddleback webinar, I thought that was interesting because it ties in to what we're talking about today, and helping kids manage their time on this. So that was interesting as well. So many mentions from Potter, from Sarah's presentation about providing kids with timelines and milestones and checkpoints along the way, and vetting those checkpoints before a kid gets too far into the project and is looking up the wrong information or whatever. So I think that's really important, is to have these smaller checkpoints, smaller milestones, and giving kids an overall timeline so they can manage their own time. Of course, rubrics for everything. Sarah provides kids a rubric for the magazine cover. There's a rubric for what your trifold presentation is going to look like. There's a rubric for what your PowerPoint. One of the things I've read over and over again as I research this topic is you have to have structure. So I know, as I was thinking, I think I did project-based learning when I was a young teacher. I didn't know it was called that. And I certainly probably didn't think about how I could structure it so that it's successful. So perhaps those of you who've tried it and maybe it wasn't as successful, thinking about providing more structure with rubrics and checkpoints. So that's great, Michelle, but I'm checking my time, by the way. Why the heck should I even consider doing this? And I think the research speaks volumes about why this is such a really cool thing to do. And again, not abandoning more traditional teaching altogether, but just perhaps considering doing a project a semester, maybe like Sarah does. So I thought this was an interesting quote, and I'm sorry I don't have the person who said it, but it's kind of a variation of what we hear a lot in education. So I hear it, I forget it. I see it and I remember it, but I do it and I understand it. So I thought that was an interesting quote that kind of segued into this part of the training. Now, listen, y'all, I am not a proponent of putting a bunch of words on a slide and reading it to you, but this really caught my attention. So if you'll just humor me here and track this print with your eyes as I read this little blurb, and then I want to unpack a little bit of it for you. So this why is project-based learning important? The link is at the end of the presentation, but I like this. It says the old school model of passively learning facts and reciting them out of context is no longer sufficient to prepare students to survive in today's world. Solving highly complex problems requires that students have both fundamental skills, reading, writing, and math, and 21st century skills, teamwork, problem solving, research gathering, time management, information synthesizing, With this combination of skills, students become directors and managers of their own learning, and they're guided and mentored by skilled teachers. So what are some interesting pieces that stood out to me with this little quote? First of all, it says that reciting facts is no longer sufficient. It doesn't say it's completely obsolete. So I want to reiterate, we're not saying completely abandon the more traditional ways of teaching. It just says that perhaps that's not enough anymore. So the term no longer sufficient, don't confuse it with obsolete. It just means we might need to add more to it. So more traditional skills, reading and writing, math, certainly important skills, but possibly considering adding those 21st century skills that I mentioned at the beginning: teamwork, problem solving, research gathering, right? And as I was looking at this list, I thought, how many schools or how many school districts or how many teachers, that phrase independent learners, but what are we actually doing in our classrooms to promote independent learning? To me, that's teamwork and that's problem solving. And that's this idea that we can critically think. And I don't know, I just thought that was a great connection. So this quote really stuck out to me. So project-based learning also provides new relevance for learning. I remember when, by the way, I used to work with Sarah Potter in Pasadena ISD at South Houston High School. And at one point we implemented rigor, relevance, and relationships, right? So this idea of making learning relevant to our kids. And I think I struggled with this a little bit as a young teacher. So project-based learning does that. It creates real life context, real life application for technology use. Kids are actually looking things up and researching. And I thought that was an interesting component. Sarah mentioned one of her projects being independent and one of her projects being group work. So certainly that new relevance comes with, how do I manage my time, or how do I work in a group? How do I collaborate effectively in a group? So all of those skills are important as well. In another quote I found, one of the major advantages of project work is that it makes school more real life. In an in-depth investigation of real world topics that's worthy of children's attention. I read a research paper, and it's cited at the end of your PowerPoint, about how much more eager kids were to come to school and how they got started on their projects even before the bell rang, and the teacher didn't have to consistently remind them to get started. So I think kids just are invested in these projects. And you know, Sarah, I don't know if you're still with us, but just, I don't know if you got to go soon, but just even talking about how eager kids are to participate, or sorry, I'm putting you on the spot again, Sarah, but what is your, if you can hear me, what is your take on the reception that kids give you of these projects?
Well, I will say that at the end of the year, in fact, you were here and interviewed some students, and there's two of the main things that we heard from our newcomer students of what made the most in them learning the English language, as well as, what made the biggest impact on them. And it was two things. It was field trips that we took and these projects. So yes, I will definitely say that it was impactful, and it just dived into things that they needed to know, as well as work on skills that they needed to have speaking in front of others.
That's right. Thank you for that. So yeah, I did a lot of research for my newcomer book that Liz mentioned at the beginning of the training. In fact, if you have a copy of the book, these beautiful children on the cover are some of Sarah Potter's kids. So let's make that connection really quick. But yeah, I remember that now, Sarah. I remember them talking about the field trips, because Sarah does take her children on a lot of field trips. But she's right. This idea that these projects are authentic. And I have a slide for that as well. So speaking of authentic, it's coming right now. One of the things we talk all the time about, well, English language learners in general, and I know this is not a session on English learners, but how do I authentically assess my kids? What kind of tests or what kind of assessments can I provide my kiddos besides that real traditional paper and pencil test? So I love project-based learning because it provides multiple assessment opportunities. Again, I wrote these slides before I spoke to Sarah, but I was making a list of all the ways that she could assess kids: the TRIFLE, the magazine cover, the KWL, perhaps multiple assessment opportunities in that draft or that essay they were writing. I think that you could assess their independent work. You could assess their group work. You could provide rubrics. So there could be a rubric for what my individual responsibilities are in this group, and then a rubric for what our group responsibilities are. So you can pick these projects apart into much smaller components, and each one of those components can be an opportunity for assessment, each one of those milestones. And then, as Sarah just mentioned, soft skills. How do you assess someone's research ability with a Scantron or a multiple choice question? Working with peers, building teams, all those other group skills, those 21st century skills that are so crucial. And I thought this was really interesting too. One teacher kept reporting that she liked project-based learning because it really helped her get to know the child more as a person. And I guess I could see that, how children approach these projects, what kinds of questions students are asking you and interacting with students. So I can see that more authentic getting to know you opportunity with the students would be important here. And from my perspective, as someone who works with teachers of English language learners, and as someone who trains and presents on language acquisition theory, something that I think is really, really important, and one of the reasons why Sarah does project-based learning with her English learners or newcomers, is the opportunity for student-teacher communication and student-student communication that's very authentic and very meaningful. And we talk about compelling input and compelling output. So definitely compelling and authentic opportunities for kids to communicate with the teacher and with each other. To me, that alone is a benefit for project-based learning. And then I already mentioned lifelong learning and independent learning. This technology, another one of the articles I read, the teacher spoke about how project-based learning has evolved over, and I think someone even mentioned that in the comments, like how it's changed in 12 years, or I didn't quite see that number, but this idea that with the internet and with all of the technology that we have at our disposal, students and teachers can reach beyond the classroom walls and do that research. And I just think that's so important for kids. They have access to so much information now, and all of that information can help enrich their projects. I think we already mentioned these: solving problems, completing projects, guides the students, and the teachers just there to facilitate. Here's another important piece for me, thinking about my English language learners. And many of you know I also have a special needs older brother, so I often think about the educational world through the lens of supporting our students who receive special education services, and then just thinking about all of the other students out there that have diverse learning needs. I think one of the things that I really, really like about this is that there's built-in accommodations already for varying backgrounds and varying levels of background experiences and varying language levels. As Sarah mentioned, many of her kids are brand new non-English speaking kiddos, and how she accommodates for that. There's a broad range of capabilities. Think about all the different learning modalities. It just in Sarah's example is, if I'm the artist, then I'm really going to love that one part where I get to draw that magazine cover or create that trifold. But then there's also a writing component. So there's the presentation. So all of these different modalities we touch upon. So students are using all these modalities. They're using all these language domains in the process of researching, solving their problem, or completing that project. And then in Sarah's examples, providing that opportunity for them to communicate either their solution to the problem they solved or present their overall project. So just this idea that multiple modalities are being targeted with one project. And again, I mentioned this is important. It frees up the teacher to work more extensively with those needier students. And that's really, really important. We do a lot of small group instruction, especially in those elementary classrooms, but I don't see it, to me, as often as I think it's valuable in the secondary classroom. So what a great opportunity there. Now I want to ask you a question. Now I'm checking my time, Liz, don't panic. I do want to get through some examples and then we will take some questions, but I do want to hear from you guys really quick. I have a slide that says, now the researchy, my favorite slides are the researchy slides, but I want to hear from you. According to research, what do you think are some other possible benefits of project-based learning? Or maybe in your own experience, if you've done it, what are some other benefits? And Sarah touched upon a few of them when she was mentioning, but maybe you could respond in the chat. What do you think might be some other benefits of project-based learning that we haven't mentioned already? Go ahead and open up your chat. There you go. Okay, I love it. They can develop their own ideas. Okay, anybody else have a... Think about numbers. Think about math. People like to crunch numbers. Less teacher taught. Bye, friend. Bye, Sarah. Building presentation skills, love of learning, working collaboratively. Yes, pride. Oh, that's a good one. Express individuality, awareness. Oh, y'all are good. All right. Let's see what the research says, right? And again, I have all of this research if you want to look at the effect sizes, if you're super nerdy statistics person like me and you want numbers to look at. Decline in absenteeism. There was a really interesting article about the apps, and that wasn't even something they were going for. It was just something they noticed as they started crunching this data. Somebody said that already, increase in cooperative learning skills. I'm not really sure how they measured that. I didn't read that entire article. I just read the abstract for that. Improvement in student achievement as measured by state assessments. You know, again, here in the state of Texas, Sarah mentioned our STAR test, but your academic state assessment. Increases in long-term retention of content, increased performance on high stakes tests, increased attitudes of student achievement towards learning. So all of these skills, and that's the article, and it's cited at the end of the presentation if you want to go back and look at that. So just incredible what you could do with project-based learning. Now I'm looking at the time again. Really quick, how do I implement project-based learning? And then I want to look through some examples with you really quick. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, listen, what would my students be saying and doing if they truly understood what they're learning about? So that's kind of like the first lens. So what would they be able to say and do if they truly understood this? And I think that's kind of a good place to start. So first of all, you got to have a problem, or you got to have a project. Maybe it answers an essential question. It definitely has to align with the student's skills and interests. And Sarah mentioned thinking specifically about which one of those events in history were going to be assigned to students based on their language skill level. So I thought that was an interesting piece as well. And I just said that. You have to have some clear objectives. You have to look at your standards and figure out what standards am I going to address with this problem. Creating your rubrics and or finding some exemplars. So I'm sure that as Sarah rolls out her projects with her students, she probably shows them some examples of what her expectations are. I think this is an important piece as well. You have to have structure, you know, especially in cooperative groups. So they could be individual or they could be in groups. You want to, I think this depends on, you know, your kids, but definitely the research suggests grouping kids in heterogeneous groups where there's diverse skill levels. In other words, you don't want to take all your high flyers and put them in one group and then all of your lower kids in one group, really thinking purposely about how you would group kids. There has to be some interdependence. One of the mistakes I made as a young teacher when I put my kids in groups to do projects is having that one kid take over and do everything. And I think I saw somebody mention that in the chat. So definitely thinking about how I can provide some independent rewards, some team rewards, and individual accountability. And I can't go into a lot of detail on this because this webinar will be like 5 hours long, but I'm a big fan of Kagan. I don't know if you're familiar with Kagan, but if you don't know about Kagan, you might want to write that down. I think it's in your PowerPoint, but they have a whole section, and I actually wrote about it in my Pathways book if you have a copy of Pathways. But how do I get interdependence? How do I get my kids to depend on each other while they're doing group work? And there's 4 pieces, and it's that positive interdependence plus individual accountability, and then equal and simultaneous interaction. So those 4 pieces are really important. And when you have those 4 pieces in place, then you have some interdependency and your cooperative groups work better. So hopefully that doesn't take us down a rabbit hole too much, but I thought this idea of how structured your groups need to be is really important for these projects to work. And then, as Sarah mentioned, and again, I wrote this slide before I spoke to Sarah, you got to create a schedule. You got to have those milestones, and you've got to monitor students' progress and hold them accountable for those deadlines. So moving kids along through the project, hitting each of those milestones is very important. Which pieces are you going to assess? Part of project-based learning is multiple opportunities for the feedback, multiple opportunities for revision of work. Again, Sarah's perfect example of that final written draft went through several vetting processes. They had multiple opportunities to tweak that draft before that final draft was due. And then multiple learning outcomes, the presentation, the PowerPoint, the trifold board, the magazine cover. And of course, again, Sarah, this is why I invited her to speak with us today. Multiple presentation modalities. Think about all these pieces that Sarah had in her example, exhibitions. Then they had a performance by having to present that. Then they had the written work. So Sarah really just hit all the boxes when she was telling me about her projects this morning, which is why I invited her. And then something else, I am checking the time, Liz, don't panic. This idea that if you want to adapt or if you want to embrace project-based learning, the best thing to do is the professional learning networks. And I Googled it and I looked up Twitter, and who knew there was an entire hashtag project-based learning and hashtag PBL chat. I just typed those into Twitter and I found so many people talking and sharing examples. So I think if you're interested in that and you're on Twitter, definitely check out those too. I want to make sure I think we talked about this. Liz, I didn't know this was going to, so yeah, again, what standards are you going to address? What milestones are you going to look for? Preparing your rubrics and your exemplars, and then finding your supplies and materials. And I want to go to some visuals I have here, because one of the things I read also, teachers' suggestions that if you're going to adopt project-based learning, you got to embrace your mistakes. Like, you're going to have this project in your mind and it's going to be spectacular, but then when you actually go to do it with your students, the wheels might fall off. And just be prepared to figure out the mistake and adapt to it. In this, thank you, Jill IBPBL on Twitter, that I found you a few days ago. Again, when I found the hashtags, I really liked this little visual that she she put up, and it's kind of blurry because I just did a screenshot, but she talked about the challenges. One of the challenges she had when she started implementing this was that students were not used to having so much freedom, and they kept asking her, what do you want from us? What do you want from us? And it took her a long time to wean her kids off of just that constant teacher direction. And she said the success that came from when students came up with project ideas that she could never even think of. So the classes were mixed. So the kids for this math example had different levels of math proficiency, and the success came from students helping each other. So again, this idea of growing and adapting, and the more that you do project-based learning, the better you get at it. And I mentioned this, assigning roles, assigning individuals tasks. Sarah mentioned using sentence stems. And then have a plan, identify what standard you want to use. Y'all don't start from the beginning. I felt overwhelmed with coming up with examples, and I was like, I wonder what Google has. So get on Twitter, Google it, get on Teacher Pay Teacher. Y'all, I know Teacher Pay Teacher has some fans and it has some foes, but I really do think, like anything in life, there's some good stuff and there's some bad stuff. You just kind of have to parse through that. But I did find some great examples of project-based learning already made for you. So before you start something from scratch, see what's already out there. If you're a science teacher, a math teacher, Google it, see what you can find. And then another piece of advice a teacher gave is plan for it, write it in your lesson plans, and then whatever you think you're going to need, add 20% more time, right? So if you think it's going to take a week, it's probably going to take more like 6 or 7 days. So I thought that was an interesting little rule of thumb. And then last but certainly not least, what I learned when I did this research. Thank you, Liz, for this topic. I learned that project-based learning can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. I found one example of a biology teacher who was actually doing genetic studies to help an African wildlife reserve. So talk about real life experiences. That teacher was sending the data that his kids collected to Africa. I mean, that was like completely overwhelming. If I saw that as an example, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I can never do project-based learning. But then you think of Sarah's examples of her students taking on, or, the roles of the people from history. So it can be as simple as complex as you want it to be. Something else I learned is you get better at it the more you do it. Many teachers reported the first couple of projects they did were not that great, but as they learned, as they adapted, their projects got better and better. You got to plan. Again, you got to know what standards you're addressing. You got to know what your milestones are going to be. This one was interesting. There is a lot of folks out there that are hardcore. I mentioned this at the beginning. I mentioned the argument I saw on one of the blogs about whether something was a performance assessment or project-based learning. And I was like, oh my gosh, don't make it so complicated. We do that so much in education. We make things so much more complicated than they need to be. So my advice would be, don't get bogged down with definitions and semantics. Figure out what your objectives are going to be, and come up with a project that you can address those objectives with. And to me, that's project-based learning. And if it's not correct, then I don't apologize for that. Something else I learned is I was doing this when I was a young teacher. I just didn't know it was called this, and I didn't know it needed to be this structured. And I bet you're probably doing some of this too. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these examples because I got to stop talking and take some questions, but I do want to tell you the rest of the PowerPoint that you see this is all linked at the end of your slides, but I found some great websites, 70 gold standard project-based ideas. This link is at the end. I got to warn you though, guys, when you go to some of these, it just kind of gives you a little summary of the project. It doesn't give you the individual steps and the individual rubrics. So this would be a great place to kind of get ideas. But if you actually want like more, and I like it because you can sort it by, subjects and all of that. But this link is also at the back of your PowerPoint. And some of these actually give you the entire lesson plan, the rubrics, all of that you need. Be forewarned. I actually went through and clicked on most of these links. And I got to tell you, some of the links are broken. So don't get frustrated or angry at me if you click on a few and the links don't work. I still think there's enough in this document. And just to show you some examples, this Middle Web article, she talked about giving kids either one of the components, communication, medicine, espionage, etc. And the project was based on how their particular component changed during the Civil War. And she was saying she was so impressed with some of the products that she got. This one, getting to know trees, all of this is linked. So, and I loved this one. This was a middle school kids math project. They were given a budget. They had to come up with a business model. They had to plan their menu with nutrition facts. They had to write a commercial. They had to actually get online with their budget and shop for supplies and materials. One kid talked about how he spent too much money on furniture, so he had to not buy some things. So great ideas. Now, we have 3 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, Liz. That was way more content than I thought it was going to be.
No, don't be sorry. That was great. I think everybody's really excited about it. Before I do my normal thing where I go and I tell everybody what's happening next week, yes, there is a link in the chat with a copy of the PowerPoint. Now, remember, we did have some last minute changes because Michelle brought in Sarah, which was phenomenal, and we're so glad you did that. But Michelle, I think that the slides showing Sarah's examples, I think they are not in the copy of the PowerPoint that is currently linked to the participants. But don't worry, everybody, we are going to email you whatever is missing. We're going to get the full slide deck for you and make sure we get that out to you in the follow-up email. We appreciate your flexibility. We thought, even though this change was last minute, it was well worth it.
I'm glad. Good.
So we appreciate your patience with getting you the full slide deck on that. So I wanted to address that. Now, let me go ahead and let everybody
you
know
guys are great. Thank you. And I still don't have my next webinar topic, so maybe we can figure what that's going to be.
We'll figure it out. We will figure it out with the questions coming up. So, okay, so next week, this is actually somewhat related to what we've talked about today. We're going to have Dr. Richard Cash and Dr. Katie McKnight, who's another frequent flyer at Saddleback Webinars. They're going to come on and talk about building a self-regulated classroom, particularly in this new e-learning or remote context that we are operating in right now. And when we talk about a self-regulated classroom, that's kind of an umbrella term for what we're talking about when it comes to student self-direction. What behaviors, habits, what are the behaviors and habits that a student needs to have to be successful academically in the current situation, in college, and beyond? And a lot of those things are the kinds of skills that we're trying to cultivate through project-based learning, and being able to operate without somebody, a teacher, providing that direction 100% of the time. So we're going to talk with Dr. Cash and Dr. McKnight about this, and what the research says, and some tips for helping to cultivate these things if you're working with students remotely. So please join us for this session next week. Check your email to register, or go to our website to register. So now let's jump in. Oh, don't forget our on-demand webinar on Saddleback Digital. We have a new ebook platform. So we have on our YouTube channel the on-demand webinar for information about our new ebook platform. We know a lot of you need your high-low books in digital format, so we've got you covered. Check out the on-demand webinar on that. Okay, let's get to the questions. So we didn't have like a ton coming in as you were speaking, because people were paying attention and keeping track that way of what was going on. So, and let me check the Q&A right now. So, okay. So yeah, we don't have a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I do have some questions, which I feel like we might be able to start us off. So in Sarah's example, she talked about the work that went in up front and choosing the topics and thinking about the students' language proficiency levels and how you could assign accordingly. So I guess my question is, in your research and learning about this topic, or if there's anybody out there who implements project-based learning, what do you think the guideposts are, or the tips around letting students choose their project versus assigning the project?
Liz, I actually asked Sarah that question this morning, because when she first told me she assigned, I was like, wait, do you assign or do you choose? And she said, well, each group has, so I guess, what am I trying to say? There's some guidance, like here's a bank of options for you to choose from. So it's not completely a free for all, but there is a little bit of student choice in there. But as she mentioned, she gives her ESOL one kids one group and the next group. So does that make sense? So it's like a bank. So it's a little bit of structure, but also enough student choice that there's some vested interest that they have in the topic as well.
That makes sense. And Tanya says, I think it should be based upon their experience with projects, meaning
Right.
that if they're very experienced with that, then perhaps they can go and have ultimate choice or maybe create their own. But if they are inexperienced with project-based learning, then they might need some more guidance. And what you said, Michelle, makes sense, that maybe the teacher, maybe I say, you're going to do this project, or maybe I say, here's a list of 5 things.
Exactly.
Why don't you pick one?
Well,
So,
because, just practically speaking, like Sarah mentioned, some of those topics are going to be much easier to research. So obviously, she's not going to give the neediest kids the harder topic to research. So I think there's a lot of teacher thought process into how you're scaffolding. If language levels is not a concern, then you might be thinking about another variable that you use to determine how much flexibility and selection you give kiddos.
makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely seems like there's a lot of planning and preparation that needs to go into this. So this is something that in my mind is good to kind of chew on over the summer and really start planning and looking up different full-scale projects with milestones and rubrics, because otherwise you need to come together and create those things, right?
Yeah, and
So
can I just say one more thing? I know we're 3 minutes past, but one of the things that I noticed, I spend a lot of time visiting teachers' classrooms. It's something I do as a consultant, is coaching and modeling in classrooms. And I see a lot of projects that are cutesy. Does that make sense? Like,
mhm,
they're cute and the kids are doing cute stuff, but I think without that mindfulness of what standards am I addressing, that's when we hear a teacher say, well, I don't do that because I don't have time, it's cute. So I think really the key here is figuring out what those standards are going to be, because we don't have time just for kids to be just doing cute stuff. It has to be addressing our standards. I hope that makes sense. So I think that's the difference between doing something meaningful versus just doing something creative or something in a classroom.
mhm. And then we did have one question I wanted to address from Carrie, and this is um, sort of on the periphery of what we were talking about, because in Texas, the ESOL 1 and 2, those can actually be substituted for English 1 and 2. So those are core credit courses here in Texas. And where Carrie is, that is not the case. So that kind of makes it challenging. And yes, Carrie, that is completely a state policy. And whatever the system is in your state, whether it's a state board of education, that would need to be, lobbied to change that. That would be where you would have to communicate is within your state for that. So
Write your congressman.
yes.
Chain yourself to a tree.
Yeah, it's very different state to state. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we wanted to thank all of you who took the time, of course, to join us today. We know that for a lot of you, this is in the middle of the workday, so you're catching the recording. So thank you for taking the time to watch the recording if you're watching this on our YouTube channel. We do hope you will join us next week. And Michelle, I'm sure that we will have you on again in the near future, and we will either extend this topic or come up with a new one, because it is always a pleasure to have you on. And ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michelle Yzquierdo from Sidelets Consulting.
Thank you.
She is a favorite, and it's just a pleasure to have you on every single time. So
Well, this was definitely out of my wheelhouse, but I really enjoyed researching this topic. It was fun to learn more, and it's like I want to write a book about this now. This is so exciting. So thank you for the idea. And if y'all were at my assessment session before and you're the one of the ones that planted the idea to move forward on another webinar on project-based learning, thank you for that.
I wish I had written down names. So
I know, me too. And what's my next topic, guys? What am I going to present next?
Yeah, come on, everybody. No, we don't want to put pressure on our attendees. They're very, very busy. So, but thank you, everybody. Please check us out on social media. Check the YouTube channel for previous webinars. And of course, thank you so much for what you do. And we will see everybody at the webinar next week. Take care.
Bye, guys.